We start looking about like, oh, well, how did under God get into the pledge? Or why is in God we trust our national motto? Or where did the national prayer breakfast come from? And started realizing evangelicals didn't create any of that. They didn't codify any of that. This was the work of mainline Protestant clergy and politicians.
From Interfaith Alliance, this is The State of Belief. I'm Interfaith Alliance President Reverend Paul Brandeis Rauschenbusch in New York City. It's tempting to view the troubling views of Christian nationalists as far outside the mainstream. But a new book argues that a lot of what we see today was incubated in America's mainline religious institutions. On this week's show, I'll talk to Brian Kaylor, co-author of Baptizing America: How Mainline Protestants Helped Build Christian Nationalism. As we keep growing our library of extraordinary interviews, I want to make sure that you are subscribed to the State of Belief podcast. Please visit stateofbelief.com/subscribe. You'll hear this episode in full, as well as recent interviews with Rainn Wilson, Anathea Butler, Rob Reiner, John Pavlovitz, Rabbi Sharon Brous, Bishop William Barber, and many others. It would really help us to have you subscribe, rate, and tell the people you're close to all about what you're hearing. The State of Belief is made possible in great part by the generous support of our listeners. If you've made a donation, thank you for helping get these conversations heard by more people who need them. If you haven't pitched in yet, information on how to do that is available at stateofbelief.com, and you can find out more about the work of Interfaith Alliance and join us at interfaithalliance.org.
You've got to foster hope. You've got to give people joy. You've got to work for positive outcomes, and don't succumb to cynicism and pessimism.
This week, Interfaith Alliance celebrates 30 years of helping build a resilient, inclusive democracy that fulfills America's promise of religious freedom and civil rights, not just for some, but for all. This movement is grounded in hard work and unyielding hope. In my time hosting The State of Belief, I've asked dozens of our guests what gives them hope in these difficult times. And we'll look back at some memorable and inspiring answers later in the show. And now to my first guest. The book isn't out until June, although, of course, you can pre-order it right now. But the subject is so compelling, I didn't want to wait to have co-author Reverend Dr. Brian T. Kaylor back on The State of Belief, Baptizing America: How Mainline Protestants Helped Build Christian Nationalism. This book explores the slippery slope of reflexive patriotism in spaces that ought to be set aside for God, not Caesar. Brian is the editor and president of Word and Way and the host of Baptist Without a Pronoun podcast. His other books include Sacramental Politics, Religious Worship as Political Action, and For God's Sakes, Shut Up. What a great title. My goodness. Brian Kaylor, welcome to the State of Belief.
Thanks. It's great to be back.
Oh my goodness. So let's just start. Like a lot of times, I do this too. When I talk about Christian nationalism, I largely, we point toward January 6th, where the people are waving Trump flags and using the cross as bayonets as they attack police. But that's actually not the only way it shows up. And your book makes a compelling case that we need to look a little bit more widely at the way that the fusing of religion and national identity has happened in spaces. And in some ways, once you open your eyes, it's hard not to see. But why don't you tell us a little bit about why you decided to write this book, how it came about, and then we'll get into some examples.
Yeah, well, I think, honestly, the way you just said it is once you kind of open your eyes, it's hard not to see it. It was a little bit of the experience that Bo and I had as we've been writing about Christian nationalism for years and started to realize that when we were talking about white evangelicals and they were trying to make the case that we were supposed to be a Christian nation, a lot of the things that they point to, I'm talking about, people like Speaker Mike Johnson or, pseudo-historian David Barton or, these classic figures that you and I have both been warning people about for years, they would point to things and then we start looking about like, oh, well, how did under God get into the pledge? Or why is in God we trust our national motto? Or where did the national prayer breakfast come from? And started realizing evangelicals didn't create any of that. They didn't codify any of that. this was the work of mainline Protestant clergy and politicians. And so eventually this pattern showed up in our minds. I'm like, wait a minute, there's something here, an untold story of how we got into this mess. It predates the rise of Trump. It predates the political rise of white evangelicals. And so maybe there's something here that we need to tell. And so that's why we started writing the book. And then honestly, we realized it was a whole lot worse than we thought it was going to be when we first dove in. We just kept finding more and more examples. And so we really do hope this will be an eye-opening book for people.
Say the name of the person who was your collaborator on this book, because we want to make sure that you don't get all the credit.
That's right. Bo Underwood is my co-author, and he is a minister in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ tradition. So one of the, seven sisters of the mainline Protestant tradition. And he's a pastor in Indianapolis today.
Okay. So I think one of the, it would be helpful to give some solid examples, because give one example of something that we look back at and we think, okay, this is something that was when you said kind of baptizing, there's baptizing America, an example of how that was done and some of the ways that mainline Protestants helped instigate that. What's a really solid example of something that maybe felt innocuous at the time, but only innocuous if you're kind of a Christian or a Protestant Christian? Yeah.
Well, so I think the example that's been the most striking for me in that lines is how under God came to be in the Pledge of Allegiance, because God wasn't initially in the pledge. Right. And so the person usually credited with writing the pledge was an American Baptist minister and a socialist. I'm sure you've been called a Baptist socialist before, but he was a like admitted, like proud Baptist socialist, and he left God out of the pledge. And it stays that way for decades.
Well, we should also mention he said liberty and justice for all, which it was a pretty radical idea. Because if you follow that to its logical extension, I think that's where some of the freedom of the Baptists and the justice for the socialists probably is reflected. Yeah,
it's definitely coming out there. And so then we get into the early 1950s, and this is where a lot of stuff is happening with mainline Protestants, are the cultural and religious and political elites, and they're doing a lot of this work in baptizing our nation. We particularly draw that metaphor from Dwight D. Eisenhower literally gets baptized a few days into his presidency in a Presbyterian church. So in 1954, Eisenhower is heading to a different Presbyterian church in D.C. for Lincoln's Day. The pastor knows that Eisenhower is going to be sitting in the pew that day and decides to give a sermon just for President Eisenhower. Right? It's an audience of one, and the rest of the congregation just happens to be there. And then this is a progressive Presbyterian Church USA pastor. He later marches with Martin Luther King Jr. He protests against the Vietnam War. Very progressive-minded pastor who's very inspiring in a lot of ways, but he also wanted us to be a Christian nation. And so he makes the case. His sermon is making the case to Eisenhower as to why God should be put in the Pledge of Allegiance, and uses a lot of arguments that, we would say today we're Christian nationalism if we heard evangelicals up talking about, why America was supposed to be built on the 10 Commandments and the word of Jesus, and that is the American way of life. And why we need to mark ourselves as God's blessed nation against those godless people at that time in the Soviet Union, right? But then the part that I think is most striking and it was stunning when I actually read through the whole sermon was he says the quiet part out loud. So he says, well, some people don't believe in God, so why would we put under God in the pledge and make them say it? And this is what he says in his sermon that convinces Eisenhower to do this. Philosophically speaking, an atheistic American is a contradiction in terms. And then he adds, they really are spiritual parasites. And then unpacks the metaphor for quite a while, several sentences of why they are parasites, because he saw that to be a good American, to be a real American, one had to be a Christian. And And the sermon works. I mean, this one sermon is why Under God is in the Pledge of Allegiance. Eisenhower is convinced. The sermon is playing on the television, and members of Congress are asking for transcripts of it. It's put in the congressional record. I mean, honestly, as ministers, we're a little jealous. I mean, we're excited if our sermon's just remembered the next Sunday. I'm sure you've had that experience at times, but it's a successful sermon. I'll give the guy the props. But it's what it says to us, though, is that this was never innocent. Like, from the beginning, the foundational sermon to get under God in the pledge wasn't just some unifying generic civil religion idea of, hey, let's all just, be under God. No, it was from the beginning excommunicating civically some Americans as not really American enough because they didn't claim to a certain religious position.
Yeah. Well, that is, it's just an important story because it's very easy for us to point a finger out. But then, once we begin to, do this kind of research, and my guess is that, that was also a moment where the evangelical church was in a lot of our, I'm not saying it was, but a lot of the mainline churches were not evangelical. Like there were a lot of, so there was this impulse, and then, this must have been taken up by other people, and a kind of a coalition must have passed it. And I'm curious, was there any resistance to it? Like, were there people who said no?
You do occasionally get some voices of resistance, but I mean, most of this legislation there in the early mid 50s is passing Congress overwhelmingly. And in some of the other examples we talk about, we do note occasionally you'll find, a rabbi or a Jewish politician speak out against, one of these proposals to codify, Christianity. But that's about the extent that we get in some of the at least in the public spaces.
Yeah. And there were also movements, I think, to insert it into the Constitution. Jesus. Yes. And, what was the genesis of that, and how does this play into that?
Yeah, so I mean, I actually think some of that actually goes further back, and we don't trace this particular part in the book, but I have written elsewhere about the effort to try to, fix the quote godless Constitution. That's one of the critiques that has been of the U.S. Constitution. And so in the Civil War, particularly, we see some of that effort because the Confederates put God in their Constitution, and so then there was some concern of like, God might favor them. And that's actually why we start seeing In God We Trust. We do talk about this in Baptizing America. In God We Trust first goes on U.S. coins in the Civil War as a response to the idea that God might bless the Confederates because they put God in the Constitution. So we need some way of stamping and almost demanding that God bless us. And again, it was some mainline Protestants, including an American Baptist pastor who was pretty influential in that particular effort.
It is so interesting how all of this reflects an understanding of God. I mean, it really is like, okay, like what will please God? Being on our money is, I think, what really God wants. I mean, it's almost as though Isaiah 58 doesn't exist, or, some of these like other things, it's so interesting how there is like the effort to dictate like what is acceptable in society, but also it's an idea of placating. And I think this is a big part of Christian nationalism at its core. It's like what will allow God to continue to favor us, and what will make God turn God's back on us. And it's all this like, I remember when Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell went on national television and said 9/11 happened because of homosexuality and abortion. And you're just like, that was like, so you like the question of like, what will God favor? I don't know. It all gets very difficult for me to kind of hang with, I have to say, as a pastor, and like, it doesn't seem to preach to me, but that's like it's an important example. And what are some, like, if you look around today, once you've had your eyes open, like once you began to look around, what are some manifestations that you continue to see within the more mainline Protestant traditions that, and in some ways for our listeners to hear, like, you know, open all of our eyes as to like what, and our ears, like what we might listen for and what we might see to say, okay, like, you know, do we really want these kind of blendings of nationalism with our faith? What are a few things to look for?
Yeah, so we've been talking about one way of Christian nationalism is seen, and that's, you know, trying to codify Christianity in government. And then Christian nationalism also goes the other way, and we see the merging of American ideas in our own congregations and churches. And I think this is the area where mainline Protestants and more progressive-minded Christians could continue to work on. And I'll be honest, my eyes were open. So my co-author, Bo, has been in the mainline tradition his entire life. I grew up a conservative evangelical and am now a mainliner. And after being a member of a Mennonite church for several years when I lived in Virginia, I went home and visited my parents at their Baptist church, and it happened to be the Sunday closest to 4th of July. And even though it was a context that I grew up in, after being out of it for several years, it was like, well, there's the flag. They're in the sanctuary. It's there every Sunday, not just that one. And we're singing all of these patriotic hymns right out of the Baptist hymnal. And they're about how great America is and,
Wow.
you know, almost worshiping the beauty of America and treating America's military as God's army, right? And it was like a light bulb moment. It really was. Like, it was almost a second, you know, born again experience of like, whoa, you know, this isn't right. This isn't gospel. And so that's some of the stuff that we try to unpack in the book is, you know, we still have the flags in our sanctuaries in most mainline Protestant churches. Particularly you get outside of the peace churches like the Mennonite Church USA, you'll find it in most mainline congregations. The hymns, when you start listening to it, as we propose in the book, there's the kind of the old idea of the Martian test. You know, try this in your own church. Imagine a Martian, you know, suddenly lands, has no understanding, no context, shows up, let's say the Sunday closest to 4th of July at your church. What might the Martian think you worship? I mean, I think they would probably get some sense of this Jesus on a cross who rises again, but then they might also think that we worship this nation, right? So that's some of that unpacking that we have to do. Because if you grow up in a white church in America, Christian nationalism is just in the air you breathe. It just seems natural, but it's not. And so we've got to separate the wheat and the chaff.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And you think about around, you know, 4th of July but now Juneteenth, and what all that looks like in a black church, and like what the black national anthem sounds like, and like the song it's singing, very different, you know, the gospel, and yet very different than what you might like, this kind of triumphalism. And it's so interesting. I'm talking to Brian Kaylor, Baptizing America, How Mainline Protestants Help Build Christian Nationalism. It's interesting for me, and I do kind of confess this in an odd way once in a while. You know, my great-grandfather wrote a book called Christianizing the Social Order. And he wrote it in like about 1912, I guess. And it was, you know, it's very interesting. I don't think he really identified it strictly with America at all, but he did. He actually, it was more of like, this is why socialism is a better way to organize structure America. But he did like, it was kind of a superimposition of a Christian ideal upon the structures of America and how we can live into that ideal. And it's all, you know, it's one of those titles that you're kind of like, oh, that's an interesting title. You can imagine a Christian nationalist writing that book today. It would read completely different, right. But the title itself, you know, does indicate a kind of presumption of Christian supremacy in the social order of America. And you know, that it's neither here nor there, but it is something I think about occasionally when but I think one of the questions I have at this point is like, we can definitely do that work, but what what's the difference? Like, I've heard a couple terms thrown around recently, like soft Christian nationalism versus hard Christian nationalism. I don't know if you may have generated that or not. You may resist it, but like soft Christian nationalism is kind of the flag in the church kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Hard Christian nationalism is we're going to control the levers of government in order to impose our will upon the people. How are those two related? But also, how can we imagine being aware of the different degrees in which they impart harm on others versus betray values of ourselves?
Yeah, and I do think that one of the things that's happening in the conversation now is this reevaluation of the kind of older term of civil religion. And I think that's what some people are now calling kind of a soft Christian nationalism, which I do think is a healthy perspective, because civil religion was sold to us for decades as this unifying God language. It's generic, it brings us all together, it's harmless, but Christian nationalism is what's really dangerous. And one of the things we argue is that civil religion was never as innocent as it seemed, right? Like under God and the Pledge of Allegiance is one of the examples actually that Robert Bellah puts in his original essay on civil religion. But it was never as unifying as it seemed. It only seemed unifying because at the time, 92% of Americans claimed to be Christian. And so, yeah, God language seemed pretty unifying, but in a more pluralistic society, it doesn't work. It's not unifying. So civil religion today would look like Christian nationalism. It just is. It can't be implemented. Right. I do think it's fair.
So that's a demographic shift in some ways,
right,
as much as it is a more of an aware. It's partially awareness, but it's also like reflective. If you, especially around young people, they're like, the moment you say under God, they're kind of like, well, who are you talking to? You know what I mean? Like, it was something like 35% would not use that language of their own volition.
That's right. And so then that demographic shift, it works both ways, is also what is fueling some of our more violent Christian nationalism.
100%.
The concern that they're losing the nation. And so that's why Christian nationalism is becoming more dangerous. But yeah, that idea of soft Christian nationalism, I mean, there is a difference between the flag being in the sanctuary and then, storming the Capitol and using the Christian flag as a weapon against, police officers. I mean, there is a difference there. At the same time, the one leads to the other eventually. I mean, we've discipled generations of people to merge and to fuse Christian and American identities. The more violent version or the hard version of Christian nationalism doesn't come out of nowhere. It might start with the kind of gateway drug version of just the American flag and the sanctuary and singing the battle hymn of the Republic. And sure, it seems all happy and innocent, but then it leads in some cases to a much more violent version. And so I think we need to work hard to detox any level of Christian nationalism, and because it is inherently a threat to democracy. And then for those of us who are Christians, it's a threat to our faith.
I think the last point is actually really important, and sometimes we leave that as the last point about, like, we are quick to talk about Christian nationalism and the threat to democracy, threat to America, threat to the idea of a multi-religious, multiracial country, but almost as the second tier, we talk about the danger to our faith. But I think actually, if you take Christianity seriously, the idea of almost Americanizing the gospel, or however you want to phrase that, is perhaps, I mean, if you believe in the eternal consequences of your faith, that's even more dangerous, because the idea that you're worshiping and you're idolizing this American gospel, where Jesus is, of course, white, and if English was good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for us, and, all these things, then what does that mean for the faith that we, practice? And, talk about, like, will it be pleasing to God? We have to ask that question about that. If you take your faith seriously, is that really what God desires? It's certainly not according to some of the scripture. But how do you manage that as someone who actually takes faith seriously? You and Bo, who's a pastor, like, it's also a question of what does it do to our faith?
Mm-hmm. That's right. And I mean, we are concerned about what it does to democracy, and it is a threat to democracy. But as Christian ministers, we're also actually even more concerned about what it does to our faith. That we say very clearly that Christian nationalism is a heresy. And so, in fact, we capitalize the in nationalism, and we explain why we do this in the book and when we write about Christian nationalism at Word and Way, because we're treating it as a religion. So we capitalize the title of religions: Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, and so we capitalize the in so that Christian nationalism is a faith, and so we're separating it out from Christianity because it goes against the very clear red letter words of Jesus. Jesus doesn't love America more than any other nation. We're not specially blessed. Our soldiers are not God's soldiers, right? We are called to be in communion with the believers, all whether they're in this side of the border or on the other side of the border. And that's supposed to be our first allegiance. I mean, Jesus said very clearly, you cannot serve two masters, and Christian nationalism challenges that assumption at best, and at worst puts the American kingdom as the true master, because we know that they will come into conflict. We know you will pick one kingdom over the other. So we're very concerned about the heresy of Christian nationalism.
It's so interesting because, like, some of the, I think, let 1,000 flowers bloom and we can smell from each of them. But talking to someone like Catherine Stewart, who, she's it's an ideology, it's a quest for power, it is not a religion. From her standpoint, someone who's outside of, she's not Christian for one thing, but she's also like looking at it from a political and sociological and framework. She's very clear that this is a political movement and an effort for power. I don't think you deny that, but your reference point and where your starting point is different. And did you see God and Country? Did you see Rob Reiner's film?
Yes.
Yeah. It was interesting to see, like, you had there were some of the leaders who were very clear, like, no, it's not Christianity. And then you had others who were like, well, wait a minute, like Anethea Butler, like, Sister Simone Campbell, both of whom I love, and admire. Sister Simone Campbell is like, no, it's not Christianity. Anethea Butler is like, well, do you know the history of Christianity? Did they, if you think it was all peace and love and understanding, you're not really reading the books. And so it's interesting, and that's neither here nor there about your book. I think it's just interesting that we can come at this from different perspectives that highlight different aspects that allow us actually to play with the language and to not it's not doctrinaire, but we are trying to address something that does feel really important, and it is a really important faith and democracy question. Mm-hmm. And I just want to thank you for writing this book. It's not the obvious book in some ways, but it was really important to bring this in and to help all of us like participate in the question. And so I really appreciate it. I did want to invite you to think about a question that I ask everyone, which is, at this stage of the game, what gives you hope?
Yeah. So, I mean, I am really pleased to see the rising coalitions of Christians and people of other faiths and no faiths, but particularly as a Christian, it's really exciting to see more Christians speaking up and saying, this isn't what Jesus taught us. This isn't our faith. This is a heresy done in our names. I appreciate the work of Christians Against Christian Nationalism, led by Amanda Tyler, and it's an ecumenical effort, though, that launched, a year and a half before the January 6th insurrection, because this is not a new issue and a new problem and a new concern. Right. And, there's a number of others. I mean, you've been doing great work here at State of Belief, the Interfaith Alliance, and it's exciting to see because it's so important in this moment. I mean, we are at a moment where democracy is at risk. In this year, we are at a moment where we're seeing whole generations. I mean, I'm a millennial, and millennials and Gen Z are walking away from churches. And I think a lot of it is in response to the way Christianity has been seen in the public sphere. And so it gives me hope, though, that people are saying, no, we're going to reclaim our faith, that we're not going to allow faith to be defined in this way, that we're not going to allow it to be used as a authoritarian weapon against others. And so there's a lot of times I spend days watching, crazy preachers say crazy things online. It's an occupational hazard. But I do draw my hope in knowing that Christian nationalism is losing. The demographics are shifting. It is not a majority perspective in the United States. We are still at a critical moment, but it is not a majority perspective, and that we can all join together and use our power together.
I love that, and I also say that, like, in my talks, like, I say the reason we're here is not because we're losing. The reason we're here is because we're winning, and more people actually believe in a multiracial society. More people actually believe in a multi-religious society than ever before, and we're here because the people who are invested in not having that come to truth are extremely fearful. And that fear is leading to some terrible behavior and violent and threatening behavior. But I think it's really important to say what you just said, and I really appreciate it. I want before I let you go, I did want you to talk just a little bit about Word and Way and what the mission is, so that people can become acquainted with it.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So Word and Way has been around since 1896. We started as an independent publication covering both Northern and Southern Baptist. We were a border state here in Missouri, and so we've always kind of crossed those different, geographical divides. And so we've had different, iterations in our life. I've been leading Word and Way since December of 2016. We've become increasingly ecumenical. We have, staff from a number of different Christian denominations, but we still lean into that idea of we want to help report the news today and help Christians think about what does it mean? What does it mean from a biblical perspective? And so one, of course, our big issues has been fighting against Christian nationalism, as we report on that. So we have a couple podcasts, Baptist Without an Adjective, Dangerous Dogma, which you've been on a couple of times, and one time real recently. And we also have a Substack newsletter, a public witness, and people can find that at publicwitness.wordandway.org, where we do deep dive analysis and reporting at the intersection of faith and politics. There's also a tab there at publicwitness.wordandway.org called Baptizing America, where people can find more information about the book and where to order it.
This is fantastic work, and I didn't realize it had been around since 1896. That is that's quite a legacy and a really important one. So congratulations on that, and to continue to bring it into this moment. And I think it's just so valuable. And boy, you started in December of 2016, so this has been a really relaxing job for you, I'm sure.
Right? I was elected to this position 7 days after the presidential election. This has been my entire tenure.
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. All right. If you had one piece of advice for a mainline Protestant pastor or lay leader who wanted to kind of really do an assessment, as well as exorcism. I don't know if that's the word we use, but an assessment, and then really lean into this question is like, is our church a vehicle for Christian nationalism, or how are we doing? What are a few initial questions that you would suggest they ask themselves and their congregation?
That's an important question. That's one of the things we do encourage pastors to do, right? Is to do that internal work. And I think you could start that by walking around your church, looking for the symbols of America, thinking about the liturgy and the prayers and the hymns, especially around those patriotic hymns, Sundays, and those patriotic services. And then, look at some of the own history of your church. In some ways, this is kind of like what we encourage churches to do with your own, history towards racism. We've encouraged churches to look at their ties to slavery. Look to your church's ties to church and state and involvement and the ways that your church is engaged. Is there a need for repentance and reflection? Is there a way of changing the focus? And then after doing all of that, then the hard work is actually then doing something, right? And I think that this is a moment where pastors can be preaching. And we're not talking about, preaching partisanship here. We're talking about preaching the gospel, but the gospel that challenges Christian nationalism, right? The global gospel, the gospel that all people are made in the image of God and that God loves all people, the gospel that teaches against the danger of idolatry and the danger of putting our hopes in chariots and in horses instead of in God. There's a lot of really significant text, and this is a time to do that difficult work. You know, there were so many people that were sitting in pews that are marching in January 6th and storming the Capitol. The day before that was too late to convince them not to join. Right? It's years of them not hearing the word, the prophetic word that they needed to hear, that led to them being susceptible to being led astray to go in and marching on storming the Capitol that day. So we've got to do that work now. We're already behind in some ways in preaching some of this work.
Well, last Sunday I had a chance to preach at Royal Lane Baptist Church in Texas, and I'll just say, like, I've heard this song now. My dad requested it at his memorial service, and then 2 times since that time I've heard it in churches, and I love it. It's Finlandia. Do you know that hymn? And basically it's based on this poem, but it's like, here I'll just read, and it's such a it's such a kind of a cure, a cleanser for that, exactly what you're talking. It says, my country's skies are bluer than the ocean, and sunlight beams on clover leaf and pine. But other lands have sunlight too and clover, and skies are everywhere as blue as mine. Hear my song, thou God of all the nations, a song of peace for their land and mine. And the entire song is about, like, everything that I think is so special about me and ours and here and America and our land. Other people feel that about theirs, and to kind of expand who we consider ours. And it's a very beautiful idea. And so what you're offering here is not a chore. It's an invitation to a beautiful spiritual exercise that it will actually be lovely and expansive and positive. So I thank you for that, and I thank you for all the work that you are doing. The book is titled "Baptizing America: How Mainline Protestants Help Build Christian Nationalism." It's due out on June 4th from Chalice Press and available for pre-order right now. The authors are Word and Way editor and president, Reverend Dr. Brian T. Kaylor, and journalist and pastor, Reverend Bo Underwood. Brian, thank you so much for being part of this State of Belief.
Thanks, Paul. It's great to be here.
This is my song, O God of all the nations. A song of peace for lands afar and wide. This is my home, the country where my heart beats.
We need to take one more break and then some highlights of hope from the past 2 years of conversations as heard here on The State of Belief, brought to you by Interfaith Alliance. Welcome back to The State of Belief. I'm Reverend Paul Brandeis Rauschenbusch. There's such a shortage of hope in our world right now. That's why ever since I started hosting The State of Belief, our weekly radio program and podcast, I've made a point of asking virtually every one of our guests this one question: what gives you hope right now? The answers have been surprisingly varied, but always confident and always inspiring. And so, as we celebrate the first 30 years of Interfaith Alliance, looking at where we've been and all the work that lies ahead, I'd like to share with you just a sample of some of those sincere messages of hope from old friends and new friends, as heard on The State of Belief. Rainn Wilson, what gives you hope right now?
Well, I'll tell you, not a lot. You know, to be really frank, it's a dark time. I think that there are, I bring up in the book, there are great forces of disintegration at work in the world right now. There's also great forces of integration. But I will say that I had no idea how people were going to receive this book. Here's this sitcom actor writing a book on spirituality. What the hell? And I worked my butt off on it all through COVID for 3 years on this book. But the response to it has been incredible. And people are very, very interested in spiritual solutions to big problems, both on a personal level and on a societal level. And so that gives me hope. And, you know, you look around and you see coalitions of people working to make the better place. I think the Black Lives Matter movement, the Me Too movement, for its various flaws here and there, has been revolutionary and made revolutionary change in America. Have we fixed racism? No. Have we fixed sexism? Of course not. But are things a lot better now than they were 6 years ago in those regards? I believe they are. I look at Greta Thunberg, a little Swedish girl on the autism spectrum who held up a sign in front of Swedish Parliament every Friday and started a global movement that has tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of followers, just from her wanting to make a small change and got the support of her parents. There are movements that are pushing us in the right direction, and it can be very overwhelming. And I tell young people, like, find the forces of integration around you and adhere to those, latch on to those, attach yourself to the groups that are really making the world a better place. Whatever it is you're passionate about. It can be the environment, it could be animal rights, human rights, it can be, you know, race issues, injustices, you know, income inequality, whatever it is, find the groups that are making an impact and get behind them and put your focus there, because it's so easy to focus on the negative.
I would love for you and Marie Mingo to talk about what gives you hope right now.
That's a great question. I have as one of my personal mantras to always leave room for hope. Because hope can become a powerful tool, especially in the face of so many things that feel hopeless. And I would say one of the things that brings me hope right now are the younger people who are not falling victim to what the society would seem to want them to do. Instead of saying, oh, they don't want me to read those books, they're saying, they don't want me to read those books. Let me go read them. Right? Let me begin to use language that I didn't necessarily know that I needed, but these books allow me to have. Now that I've got that additional language, I can see these systems and structures in ways that I can say, I might not be able to challenge the whole thing, but in this part, I can have that conversation with my uncle because he says that stuff every time. And I now know that this is this thing and I can challenge it, right? So I am inspired and I have hope from young people who are saying, I won't accept what you're trying to tell me to do, but I'm going to actually lean in to what you're telling me not to do. So because I know that there's some power there. I often ask my students, pay attention to how power is operating. And then that's how you can figure out what you need to begin to challenge. And my hope is found in the fact that people are challenging it. And we can't get caught up in the louder voices that would have us think that nothing is being done. These folks are doing it. Young, old, black, white, polka dot. They're doing the work. And it's time for us to try to elevate those everyday folks who are taking the risk in small and large ways to make the world better for those who are still to come.
Reverend Susan Sparks, what brings you hope right now?
The kids in our services, I have to tell you. I mean, we have this beautiful collection of children. And sometimes, I actually said in the sermon on Sunday, the theme was hope. And I got up there and I was like, I just want to tell you all this is a hard sermon to write because today's theme is hope. And unless you live somewhere like, say, Oz, this is a hard sermon to write. And in the midst of that moment of me saying it was hard, one of our kids comes screaming down the aisle, just laughing her head off with like gum stretched out of her mouth. And she's like 2.5. And the whole place broke up laughing. And there was just this moment of, maybe there's hope here. And I think we just, all of us, watch what's going on. And as people of faith, we have hope. We are told to have hope. We are given sources for hope. As human beings, it's tough right now. And I have to say, I struggle with it in my own life. Is there really hope now to be had? And when I really am not completely clear, I lean back into the kids and just watch them for a few minutes. And the way that they interact with each other, no matter what the skin color, no matter what the religion, no matter what the ethnicity, no matter what their stance on environmental issues, they're playing, they're laughing, they're hugging on each other. And I just think, if we can protect them and we can lay a groundwork with them to keep that place of love within them, then maybe we have a chance. Because right now, I'm afraid that the generations that are, the adult generations right now are pretty locked in to where they are. I mean, it's like a greeting card I saw that's two little 1950s ladies and they're smoking cigarettes, and one says, well, one of us is wrong. She looks at her friend and she goes, and the other one's me. They're so locked down. And so I think I have to be honest with you, Paul. I have serious doubts about it myself sometimes, but I have to preach on Sunday. So I got to find a way to share some glimmer of hope with people. And to me, it starts with the next generation and what we can learn from them.
What gives you hope right now? Eddie Glaude.
This is a question that I confronted in writing Begin Again. Because Baldwin was asking so much of me that I thought I was going to lose everything. So I was drinking too much too much Jameson, Irish whiskey, and the like, grappling with what he was asking of me. And there was this moment in Istanbul when a reporter from Ebony asked him this question. And he was in Istanbul after the assassination of Dr. King. He had a love affair, had fallen apart. He had just tried to commit suicide. He was drinking, had his Johnny Walker Black and a cigarette in hand. And the reporter says, well, what about hope? And Baldwin responded with this big gap-toothed grin, hope is invented every day. So to answer your question, I've now been grappling with what he means by what is my hope? And Baldwin's hope is invented every day. If you have to invent hope every day, Paul, you have to beat back despair every day. So if you have to invent hope every day, that means you're fighting despair every day. So I got to figure out how to swing my feet off the bed and plant them on the floor and get up. So my hope is invested in the miracle that human beings can be. I'm always hopeful, not optimistic, hopeful that human beings will do something miraculous in the midst of the darkness. If I don't have faith in us, an abiding faith in us, then I'm lost. So where do I find hope? I find hope in the unexpected places where human beings are doing some things that you never could imagine they could do. And that becomes the seed, the ground for a different kind of way of being in the world. So my hope is in us. Always.
Please be sure to subscribe to The State of Belief at Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform, or at stateofbelief.com/subscribe. We need your help to keep making The State of Belief. Become a partner in this crucial work with a financial contribution today. Information on how to donate is available at stateofbelief.com. That's stateofbelief.com. And share what you're getting out of this show with the people in your networks. Let's get more people listening and keep these conversations going on Facebook and Instagram at State of Belief. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of Religion News Service or Religion News Foundation. The State of Belief is produced by Ray Kirstein and is a production of Interfaith Alliance. Become a member today at interfaithalliance.org. And be sure to join us next week. I can't wait. Until then, I'm Paul Brandeis Rauschenbusch on The State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet.